Okay, this is a quick audio review of The Myth of Immigrant Criminality and the Paradox of Assimilation from Race, Class, and Gender, 10th edition. Okay, so many who immigrate to the U.S. come from Mexico and Central America and are men, who are then stereotyped and associated with higher rates of crimes and incarceration. So just the process of being undocumented leads some to reinforce ideas of criminality, taking one act and turning it into criminalizing the person themselves and not the act of crossing the border. This article uses a lot of data to refute these stereotypes and dispel the myths that are commonly accepted in the culture. The reality is that the problem of crime in the United States is not caused by immigrants, regardless of citizenship or legal status. But the reality is these misperceptions, these myths, guide policymakers. They are tropes that are promoted in the media. These are commonly held assumptions in the general public, which undermines development of reasoned responses to crime and reasoned responses to immigration. Okay, so let's look at the reality versus the myths. So in the reading, they point out that crime rates have declined as immigration has increased. Even as the undocumented population has doubled, violent crime has actually dropped over 30%, while property crime has also dropped by nearly 30%. Also, immigrants have lower incarceration rates. So the incarceration rate for native-born Americans is 5 times higher than for the foreign-born. The authors further demonstrate this point by looking at different ethnic groups and comparing their native-born versus foreign-born populations' rates of incarceration. For example, native-born Hispanic men in the year 2000 were 7 times more likely to be incarcerated than foreign-born Hispanic men. Similarly, the rates of incarceration for non-Hispanic white men was 3 times higher in the year 2000 than the rates for foreign-born non-Hispanic white men. So the authors continue to demonstrate this pattern with other ethnic examples, ultimately confronting the incorrect assumption about immigrants and really show how incarceration rates are actually lower for immigrants. The reality that they point to is that immigrants have lower incarceration rates than natives among high school dropouts. So for all ethnic groups, the risk of imprisonment is highest for men who are high school dropouts. But the incarceration gap by education for the foreign-born is much narrower. So the highest incarceration rates among high school dropouts is non-Hispanic Black men, who have an incarceration rate 3 times higher than foreign-born Black high school dropouts. The same pattern is true for native-born Hispanic men, whose incarceration rate is 11 times higher than the foreign-born population. So the authors continue to demonstrate this pattern in the reading, using examples of Mexicans, Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and Vietnamese populations. So the paradox of assimilation itself, this is very interesting. So the higher rate of imprisonment for native-born men than foreign-born men highlights the dark side of assimilation. The process of assimilation often involves learning English, gaining higher levels of education, and improving chances in the economy and in society. But the article also demonstrates that not all aspects of assimilation are positive. For instance, when it comes to health in America, health status worsens the longer an immigrant lives in America and declines over generations. This is due to the fact that children and grandchildren of immigrants become subject to the economic and social forces of the culture, such as an increased likelihood of criminal behavior. So similar to health, likelihood of incarceration increases with time in the country and increases by generation, as children and grandchildren of immigrants have higher rates of incarceration than their immigrant parents or grandparents. This shows the paradoxical nature of assimilation. Also, overall, the short article confronts the culturally promoted myth of immigrant criminality by demonstrating patterns of facts. Even when examining multiple ethnic groups, these patterns challenge the taken-for-granted stereotypes about immigrants that underlie racism, hatred, xenophobia, but also policymaking and legislation in this country, which is another reason why we need to use facts to confront stereotypes and to dispel myths like the myth of immigrant criminality.